So to make sure that the computer can actually finish that game and guess the right number, we need to check what the computer guessed and then kind of end the game if it's the number we entered. For that, we can use another React hook, and that's the useEffect hook. useEffect allows you to run side effects, or in general, allows you to run logic after every render cycle. And just as mentioned before, if this whole React hooks thing is relatively new for you, definitely check out some dedicated React hooks resources or dive into my React Complete Guide course where I cover hooks in detail. So what I'll do with useEffect now is I'll call it here after initializing my state and my refs here. And in there, we pass a function. So useEffect takes a function, and this function by default runs after every render cycle for this component. So every time it has been rendered, this function is executed after it has been rendered. That's also important. Not before, not simultaneously, after. Now in there, I want to check if the current guess the computer made is equal to the user choice, because that means the game is over. Now, that can't be the case for the first render cycle, of course, because we exclude the user choice from the guessable numbers, but from the second roll on, so once we clicked lower or greater for the first time, that can happen. So in there, I then want to kind of fire a the game is over message and send that to app.js so that we can swap the game screen for a game over screen. Now, we don't have that screen yet, so let's add it. Let's add a game over screen here in the screens folder. And let's create a very simple one for now. We'll fine tune it later. In there, I'll simply have a view and a text and a style sheet. So what we typically import from React Native. Then have the game over screen component in there, which takes some props and then returns some JSX in the end. Here we have the styles with style sheet create, and then we export the game over screen as a default. Now in there, as I said, I want to keep this simple for now. I'll just have a view in there with a text of the game is over, and we'll output more details there later. For now, here I'll just assign some style, my screen style, which I'll add to this object we pass to the style sheet here at the bottom, set flex to 1, and maybe justify content to center, and then align items to center so that this text is centered for the moment. Now we have the game over screen, and we want to render this instead of the game screen, well, if the game is over. So let's go back to the app.js file and import the game over screen from the screens folder and there from game over screen. And the question now, of course, is what's our condition for rendering this? Well, in the end, we'll need one additional piece of information anyways, and that's the number of rounds it took the computer to finish the game. So one thing I want to store here in the app component is another state I manage, and that is the number of rounds it took the computer to finish, which is 0 initially because we haven't started a game yet. And I'll name this guess rounds and set guess rounds, and you can name this whatever you want. Now the goal is to set this when the game is over. So for that, I'll also add another function here to the app component, game over handler, and there I want to get my number of rounds as an argument, so I expect to get this here so that I can call set guess rounds to my number of rounds I got here. Now the game over handler should be triggered from inside the game screen, obviously. So here on the game screen, I want to pass in a prop which I'll name on game over, sounds like a fitting name, which can be called from inside the game screen then, or which holds a function reference which can then be called from inside the game screen. And the function reference is a reference at this game over handler function, of course. So inside of game screen, we can now use the on game over prop to execute this function and pass the number of rounds it took the computer to guess our number. Then we set this number of rounds here, store it in our guess rounds state. And now in the app component, we know that if guess rounds is 0, the game hasn't started yet, or it's running. If it's greater than 0, then the game over handler executed and the game is over. So we want to show the game over screen if guess rounds is greater than 0. By the way, if we start a new game, I also want to reset my guess rounds to 0, because if a new game starts, we want to reset the number of rounds the computer took to 0. So if it's greater than 0, the game is over. So in that case, I want to show the game over screen. So here, if I check if we have a user number, in which case I show the game screen, that's only correct if guess rounds is smaller or equal than 0. Smaller is not really possible, but still we can check for that. So if that's the case, then we know the game is certainly running. Else if guess rounds is greater than 0, then we know the game is over, and therefore content will be equal to game over screen. Right now, that's just a component like this without any props which we pass in. So now we have a condition where we render the game over screen. All we now need to do, we need to use the onGameOver prop here in our game screen to in the end call this function and forward the number of rounds to the app component. So back in the game screen, if useEffect here determines that the right choice was made, the right guess was made, and therefore the game is over, then in here, I want to call props onGameOver as a function and forward the amount of rounds it took the computer to guess our result or our choice. And that's therefore another state we have to manage here in the game screen. We have our rounds and set rounds, and initially that is 0. When this component is created for the first time, this is of course 0. And rounds is therefore now what I forward here, because that's a number will increment with every guess, because in the next guess handler, if we're generating a next guess, besides setting that guess here in our state, I of course also want to set my rounds, and there use the function form where I get my current rounds, and I return current rounds plus 1. So I add 1 to my current amount of rounds I store in my state, so that the new state, well, is old rounds plus 1 because a new round started. So with that, we're managing the amount of rounds, and we're using this as a condition in the app component to render the game over screen. And in the game screen, we check whether the game is over here in useEffect. And right now we do this whenever this component re-renders. Now, we could do that, but we can also simply be more honest or more direct regarding the dependencies of this effect. And that's something you can be, or you can do, by adding a second argument to useEffect. First argument is the function it should execute after rendering the component. Second argument you pass to useEffect is an array of dependencies of this function. And here you have to specify any value that's coming from outside of this effect function. So in our case, that would be the current guess. That would be props user choice and props onGameOver. And whenever such a value changes, this effect will rerun. So whenever it has changed after a render cycle, the effect will rerun, I should say. If a render cycle occurred and the values you specified here are still the same as for the previous render cycle, then the effect will not rerun. So the effect will now only rerun if one of our dependencies changed. Now, as I said, props user choice and props onGameOver are also dependencies. And to take care of these, I'll use a modern JavaScript syntax where I use object destructuring to destructure my props and get user choice and onGameOver out of them. This syntax might look strange, but it's like array destructuring just for objects. We're pulling these properties, so these property names, out of this props object and store them in constants with equal names, so that here we can now just use user choice and just use onGameOver, since we have these values now stored in constants of that name, pulled out of props. And I'm doing this because now we can add user choice and onGameOver as dependencies in this list. Otherwise, we would have to add props here, and that actually changes whenever the parent component changes. Therefore, it's not a good check. This is a better check because now we make sure if anything else in props changes, we don't care. Only if one of these two values changes, then this effect should rerun. Now with that, we have our check in place that should hopefully lead to the game over screen being presented if the computer guessed our number. So now let's save this and let's give it a try. Maybe here on Android to mix things up. So I'll enter a number here, 32, confirm, start a game, and it's 2, so it should be greater. Let me also show you how the warning looks like on Android. It's this default Android alert. So 32 it was, so therefore of course should be greater, should still be greater. Now it should be lower, should be lower, should be greater, should be lower, should be lower, should be greater, should be greater. the game is over. That's looking good. The guess probably was 32, would make sense regarding the sequence of numbers we had here. And therefore, this output makes sense here.